The World Economic Forum's recorded history has been manufactured to appear as though the organization was strictly a European creation, but this isn't so. In fact, Klaus Schwab had an elite American political team working in the shadows that aided him in creating the European-based globalist organization. If you have a decent knowledge of Klaus Schwab's history, you will know that he attended Harvard in the 1960s, where he would meet then-Professor Henry Kissinger, a man who Klaus Schwab would form a lifelong friendship. However, as with most information from the annals of the World Economic Forum's history books, what you have been told is not the full story. In fact, Henry Kissinger would recruit Klaus Schwab at an international seminar at Harvard, which had been funded by the US CIA. The connection has largely gone unnoticed until now. Johnny Vedmore's research indicates that the World Economic Forum is not merely a European creation. In reality, it is instead an operation which emanates from the public policy grandees of the Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixonian eras of American politics, all of whom had ties to the Council on Foreign Relations and the associated Round Table movement, with a supporting role played by the CIA. There were three extremely powerful and influential men, Kissinger was among them, who would lead Klaus Schwab towards the ultimate goal of complete American empire-aligned global domination via the creation of social and economic policies. In addition, two of the men were at the core of manufacturing the ever-present threat of global thermonuclear war. By examining these men through the wider context of geopolitics of the period, the goal is to show you how their paths would cross and coalesce during the 1960s, how they recruited Klaus Schwab through a CIA-funded program, and how they were the real driving force behind the creation of the World Economic Forum. So there are three individuals, Herman Kahn, Henry Kissinger, and John Galbraith, who have become three of the most influential people in America with regards to thermonuclear deterrence, foreign policy creation, and public policy making. Most of the focus throughout these men's career had been on Europe and the Cold War. However, their varying roles in other important events of the period have all the potential to easily distract researchers from other more subversive and well-hidden events. These three powerful Americans were all linked with each other in various ways, but one interesting and notable thread in particular ties these men together during the period between 1966 and 1971, with the creation of the Kissinger-led 22-man panel of advisors to help, and I quote, shape European policy. But that's not all. They are also tied to the founding of the World Economic Forum. All three men were members of the Council on Foreign Relations, the American branch of the Anglo-American imperialist Round Table movement. Henry Kissinger already had deep ties to the CFR, having been recruited by them straight after graduation. Galbraith had reportedly resigned his membership of the Council on Foreign Relations in a highly public way in 1972, stating that the council was boring and telling a journalist most of the proceedings involve a level of banality so deep that the only question they raise is whether one should sit through them. Although there is no public date to when Galbraith became a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, he had written for their publication from as early as 1958, with the article Rival Economic Theories in India. These articles were printed in Foreign Affairs, the official Council on Foreign Relations journal or magazine. Herman Kahn could also be found publishing some of his essays through the council as well, writing the piece Our Alternatives in Europe in July 1966, and, of course, If Negotiations Fail in July 1968. Both of these were published as he was working as an official advisor to the State Department. Before the 1960s, these three extremely influential American intellectuals had each been deeply involved in trying to understand the problems of a post-war Europe, and they tried to map out the future of the war-stricken continent. Galbraith had traveled extensively throughout Europe, including his studies into German policies during the Third Reich and after the collapse of Hitler's Germany. Galbraith would go on to study the Soviet systems in much of the same way. Galbraith's influence over the future President John F. Kennedy from a very early age cannot be understated, and Galbraith was powerful enough to see JFK begin withdrawing troops from Vietnam on his recommendation. When Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Galbraith would be the man to draft the incoming president's initial address to the nation. But Galbraith was soon to be pushed off to the sideline, So, during the turmoil of the 1960s, Galbraith would be close with Henry Kissinger, both men being Harvard professors, members of the Council on Foreign Relations, and both men seemingly had the same goal of making Europe stable enough so that the continent was well defended against any potential Soviet aggression. To Galbraith and Kissinger, and also to the wider American political establishment, Europe was the main threat to not only global stability, but also to the prevailing American hegemony in general. The relative stability in Europe during the post-war period was perceived as being due to the thermonuclear standoff. And, from very early on, Kissinger identified this dynamic and began to manipulate the situation for the benefit of American supremacy, which is interesting because they're all working towards the downfall of America today. Henry Kissinger was not alone in trying to understand the complex dynamics at play in relation to thermonuclear deterrence and how it affected policy making. Herman Kahn was the leading figure on thermonuclear strategic planning during the same period, and Henry Kissinger's work concerning the same subject matter from the mid-1950s onwards would see him cross paths with Herman Kahn on many, many occasions. So Herman Kahn offered Henry Kissinger something which all politicians and policymakers crave: the ability to predict future events with relative accuracy. Herman Kahn was a veritable prophet concerning the technological advancements of the not-so-distant future, and his work, although often stoic and bereft of human emotion, has stood up very well to the test of time. Kahn and Kissinger's goals would overlap during the mid and late 1960s, and as the threat assessments Kahn made during this period became more optimistic, Henry Kissinger would see Kahn's work as being fundamental in offering a new future to the people of the world. However, Henry Kissinger's vision of the future was not a free and fair society advancing into a quote-unquote brave new world, but rather Kissinger intended to create an image of the world which had been skewed by his own Council on Foreign Relations driven establishment perspective. Although he would attempt to rebrand himself as a true statesman, Kissinger would continue to subvert not only foreign democratic processes, but also to undermine the American system for the eventual benefit of a globalist agenda.
The emblem of the Bush presidency will be the emergence of a new international order.
Within the next 4 years, we will see the emergence of a new international order.
The beginning of a new international order.
When Klaus Schwab was first recognized by Kissinger as a potential future globalist leader, the relatively young German would be introduced to Galbraith and Kahn. This would coincide with Herman Kahn's work identifying the need to specifically train individuals with leadership potential separately from those who attend the prevailing standard educational models. Well, that sounds a lot like Klaus Schwab's Young Global Leaders program, doesn't it?
Even Vladimir Putin and so on, they all have been young global leaders of the World Economic Forum. Mm-hmm. But what we are very proud of now is the young generation, like Prime Minister Trudeau, President of Argentina and so on, that we penetrate the cabinet. So yesterday I was at a reception for Prime Minister Trudeau, and I know that half of this cabinet, or even more half of this cabinet, are for our actually young global leaders of the world.
So, in the year Klaus Schwab left Harvard, he was approached by Peter Schmid-Heine, who had just sold Escher Weiss to the Sulzer Group. Escher Weiss was a Ravensburg factory during World War II, and had been managed by Schwab's father, Eugene Schwab. Now, if you haven't watched my video about this subject, I suggest you do. It's pretty interesting. Anyway, he had been involved in making heavy water turbines for the secretive Nazi atomic bomb effort. Klaus Schwab speaks in one interview about the moment Schmid-Heine called him up, saying, and I quote, "You come from Harvard now and know modern management methods. Come to help make the integration a success." However, what Klaus Schwab did not mention is that he would help Sulzer and Escher Weiss to merge, resulting in a new company called Sulzer AG. That company where Schwab would serve as director, while they would go on to break international law by aiding the South African apartheid regime in its illegal thermonuclear bomb program. Again, that is something that's covered in the deep dive into Klaus Schwab. Anyway, Klaus Schwab had only just left the sphere of influence of some of the most significant experts in thermonuclear war, and within the same year as leaving Harvard, he would head up a merger of a company dealing in the propagation of thermonuclear bomb technology to despotic regimes. For many of us who do not map out terrifying extinction scenarios, we may be left believing that apartheid South Africa gaining the nuke at this point in history would have been one of the worst things that could have happened. However, Herman Kahn's thermonuclear disaster scenarios had led the rotund genius to believe that barring a disaster, sabotage, or an accident, no major nuclear power would dare fire a thermonuclear weapon as an act of aggression for the foreseeable future. In fact, the establishment thinking had changed significantly, to the point where Herman Kahn and others were advising that in certain scenarios, making a country such as France a nuclear power could have significant benefits to security, both regionally and globally. Thermonuclear war was no longer the be-all end-all of strategic defense policy, and it was in the dying embers of the 1960s where the same people who had caused all of the fear of a thermonuclear apocalypse really did stop worrying and learned to love the bomb. So is Klaus Schwab the real brains behind the formation of the World Economic Forum? What are we to make of the CIA's involvement in the seminar Kissinger used to recruit Klaus Schwab? Were the powers that lurk behind organizations like the Council on Foreign Relations the real founders of the globalist policy-making organization? Was the World Economic Forum meant to simply unite Europe? Or was it actually meant to go on to unite Europe with America, followed by the remaining super-states, into a new world order designed by powerful Council on Foreign Relations grandees like Kissinger, Kahn, and Galbraith?
There's a need for a new world order, but it has different characteristics in different parts of the world.
But today, with Asia already outproducing Europe, India and China are clearly becoming part of our new order.
We are now facing a common challenge. And the challenge is how to build a world order for the first time in history on a global basis.
These three powerful men each saw in Schwab a reflection of their own intellectual desires. Klaus had been born into the latter half of the same decade in which the technocratic movement had begun, and he would come from the first generation to have their formative years in a post-war world. Herman Kahn's predictions for the future had not only been an exercise in human wonder, it had also been a project to make these predictions a reality as quickly as possible and regardless of consequences. In 1964, Klaus Schwab would be trying to decide what he was going to do with his career. He was 26 years old and looking for direction, and he would find that direction from a familiar source: his father, Eugene Schwab. Now, Eugene had been on the wrong side of history during World War II and had been involved in the Nazi atomic bomb effort. Eugene Schwab would tell his son that it would only be at Harvard where you would truly be able to flourish. In a divided post-war Germany, the intense fear which came from the ever-impending and well-dramatized threat of thermonuclear war had become an everyday part of people's psyche. Harvard was well known at the time for playing a central role in Cold War policy making. They were trying to target European affairs, and Klaus Schwab would put himself right in amongst the main movers and shakers on the thermonuclear disaster scene. While he was at Harvard, Klaus Schwab would attend Kissinger's international seminar, which was funded by the CIA via a known conduit. Through this process, Klaus Schwab would be introduced to a group of men who were actively trying to influence European public policy, and by any and all methods, including using the fear of impending nuclear doom. They would recognize his potential straight away, so much so that they would be there for Schwab all through the founding of the World Economic Forum, with Kahn, Kissinger, and Galbraith bringing perceived credibility to the project. It was not easy for Schwab alone to explain to European elites what he intended to do, so he would bring Kahn and Galbraith to Europe to persuade other important players to become part of the project. Galbraith would be the first keynote speaker at the forum, with Herman Kahn's presence also drawing significant interest. However, the Second World Economic Forum would stall without the presence of the bigger names, and Klaus Schwab knew he would need something to draw in the crowds for the third installment of his forum's annual meeting. So, in 1972, the Club of Rome's founder, Aurelio Pesci, had published his controversial book, The Limits to Growth, a book that had been commissioned by the Club of Rome and which took a Malthusian approach to overpopulation. The book would call into question the sustainability of global economic growth, and Pesce would be invited by Schwab to make the keynote speech at the 1973 World Economic Forum. This risque public relations strategy paid dividends for Schwab and his organization. From that point on, the forum would grow in size, scale, and power. But it all began with a CIA-funded course run by Henry Kissinger at Harvard. Now, Klaus Schwab has become more than just a technocrat. He has been very vocal on his intention to fuse his physical and biological identities with future technology.
It's at the end, what the fourth industrial revolution will lead to is a fusion of our physical, our digital, and our biological identities.
He has become a living caricature of an evil Bond-like villain, conducting secretive meetings with the elites high up in the mountaintop chalets of Switzerland. And I do not think that image we have of Schwab is an accident. In the post-war years, something very unique happened in Western culture, when the government began using mainstream media as a tool to target the public with military-grade psychological operations. The ruling establishment would discover that marrying the drama of conflict scenarios with media such as film would be extremely useful. It's almost akin to creating the self-propagating propaganda in some cases. Films like Stanley Kubrick's Dr. Strangelove were fantastic vehicles for people to understand the absurdity of thermonuclear disaster scenario planning. If people perceive you as an all-powerful evil villain, then you may not gain the support of the common man. However, you will gain the attention from those who seek power and wealth. It's almost like a moth to flame. But what they're referring to are the people they consider stakeholders in society. This is very important to understand. The projection of extreme wealth and power will attract and bring the quote-unquote stakeholders of society to the World Economic Forum's table. Now, with those stakeholders on board, Klaus Schwab's main ideological product, stakeholder capitalism, will see the transfer of power away from true democratic processes and onto a system of governance by a small, pre-selected leadership group. This group will be trained to continue the agenda set for them by the previous generation. As predicted by Herman Kahn, they will hold all the cards, while the common people will be left with just the illusory pseudo-democratic process, poverty, and constant, absurd, psychological operations to distract us all, constantly. Klaus Schwab would soon become everything Herman Kahn had feared during his most pessimistic predictions. When the Club of Rome produced the Limits to Growth report, it was Herman Kahn who would refute its findings and rally against its pessimism, while at the same time, Klaus Schwab would make it central to his machinations and have the founder be the keynote speaker at his forum in Davos. Okay, so our current geopolitical situation is seemingly regressing back towards the East versus West dynamic of the Cold War era. Again, with recent events in Ukraine, the mainstream media is regurgitating nuclear talking points which are completely parallel to those of 60 or 70 years ago. Now I believe that there is a very obvious reason to our return to Cold War rhetoric. It's a very obvious sign that Klaus Schwab and his backers are out of ideas. They appear to be returning to a geopolitical paradigm in which they feel safer and, more importantly, which will cause mass fear of thermonuclear war. This rinse and repeat cycle will always happen once an ideological movement is running out of original ideas. Since the late 1960s, Klaus Schwab has been trying to create the world in which Herman Kahn predicted. However, Herman Kahn's vision for the future, even though it was pretty accurate, is over a half a century old. Klaus Schwab's technocratic movement depends on the successful development of innovative technologies which will advance us towards a vision largely manufactured back in 1967. Just by studying a more refined list of Kahn's predictions, you can see that every idea that Klaus Schwab promotes is almost entirely based on Kahn's vision of the year 2000, and that document's vision of what our future may look like are predictions dating back to the late 1960s. However, what Klaus Schwab appears to ignore while forcing his futuristic agenda on us all is that many of Kahn's predictions were also combined with warnings of the dangers which will be created from future tech advancement. So as Klaus Schwab reaches the end of his life, he appears to be desperate to push forward a radical futurist agenda with the obvious potential for global disaster. Now, Johnny Vedmore believes that the World Economic Forum is reaching its maximum level of expansion before its inevitable collapse. Because eventually, those people who love their own national identities will stand up against the immediate threat to their specific culture, and they will fight back against the globalist rule. And I, for one, surely hope he is right about that. So the basic idea is that you cannot make everyone a globalist, no matter how much brainwashing is applied. There is a natural contradiction between national freedom and globalist rule, which make the two completely incompatible. So as a very pertinent final thought, Herman Kahn would write something extremely significant during the same year in which Klaus Schwab would leave Harvard. In the aforementioned Hudson Institute document of 1967, entitled The Ancillary Pilot Study for the Educational Policy Research Program, Final Report, Herman Kahn writes, and I quote, "It has become increasingly clear that our technological and even our economic achievements are mixed blessings. Through progress, issues arise, such as the accumulation, augmentation, and proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, the loss of privacy and solitude, the increase of governmental and/or private power over individuals, the loss of human scale and perspective, and the dehumanization of social life or even the psychobiological self, the growth of dangerously vulnerable, deceptive, or degradable centralizations of administrative or tech systems, the creation of other new capabilities so inherently dangerous as to seriously risk disastrous abuse, and the acceleration of changes that are too rapid or cataclysmic to permit successful adjustment. Perhaps most crucial, choices are posed that are too large, complex, important, uncertain, or comprehensive to be safely left to fallible humans." And this is exactly what we've all been warning about.